Would anyone else like to take the floor? Mr. Zell, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I will speak in German. Wir sprechen ja heute über die Demokratie in Afrika.
We are talking about democracy in Africa. Several cases have been mentioned. It's a fact that democracy in Africa is at risk. Tanzania, Côte d'Ivoire, opposition politicians have been excluded from elections. Other people put into prison, Volunteer Sal, for example, because they criticised the government. Or Kenya, Malawi, the elections had to be repeated. But obviously, we don't have to look at Africa just to find examples along these lines, because Marine Le Pen was excluded from the presidential elections just a few weeks ago in France as well, and members of my own party in Rhineland-Pfalz were no longer allowed to become officials, and that's probably against the constitution, which you tend to see in authoritarian regimes. In other words, democracy is at risk not only in Africa, here in Europe as well. Our free democratic constitutions are being threatened, not from the outside, but rather from the inside, as J.D. Vance stated quite clearly in Munich. The causes for this democratic backsliding in Europe are the excesses in national conservative parties, because left-wing parties are being voted out. But instead of accepting the situation, the left are looking for to stop a free transition of power. They claim they're saving democracy by actually doing away with democracy. That's the situation in Europe. And that's why I think we have to be very careful in how we criticise what's happening in Bamako, Kinshasa or Timbuktu. I think we have to look what's happening in Paris, Madrid and Berlin with democracy there. I think we need to look at our own homes before we look elsewhere.
Thank you. I don't see any further requests to take the floor. Then perhaps I can have a final question. I would like to pick up on what Michael Gahler and Omar Speit said. First of all, Mr. Briand, Michael Gahler rightly underlined that you mentioned positive examples in Africa, like Senegal, like Ghana. But why is it so difficult to call a spade a spade? Why don't we name the countries where we have really witnessed democratic backsliding? And if we identify the countries, why don't we have an open debate? What can we actually do as European Union, and what are the consequences for this? And the second point, I'm picking upon what Urma Speit said. Mr. Briand, I remember, must have been about 2 years ago, a conversation I had with a diplomat from an African country. And she said, Mr. McAllister, you know, my country always votes with the European Union in the United Nations General Assembly. We vote for resolutions targeting against the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. We vote for resolutions criticizing human rights violations also in China. And we stand firm, she told me. We even stand firm if the next day the Russian or the Chinese ambassador phones and he or she might be very upset. We stand firm. But of course we start to think that our neighboring country votes in the United Nations General Assembly always against our positions as European Union. They vote in favor of Russia, they vote in favor of China, or at least they abstain, and it doesn't make a difference at all. So, I mean, African diplomats, African leaders are saying, well, I can be with the West, I can be with Europe, or I can not be with Europe, but it doesn't matter. It will have no impact at all when it comes to our financial support. And that's why I've been here now for 11 years. Why is it that in the Commission and also in the European External Action Service, why is it so difficult that the principle of more for more, which of course logically might mean less for less, why is that so difficult to implement? And we must also, I mean, we need to send out a signal to those brave countries in Africa, to those brave governments who are defending the international rules-based order, who are defending multilateral cooperation. But for us, in the end, it seems to be as if we treat everyone in the same way anyhow. But if we treat everyone equally, do we then expect equal treatment? And this is something we need to critically reflect. And this is why the Development Committee in our Parliament, the Foreign Affairs Committee in our Parliament, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, we are trying to make Africa, the situation in African countries, the development of African countries, more an issue. But in the end, that also must lead to some kind of consequences on your side. And I would like to hear from you, do you have any kind of critical reflections of this kind? Or do you believe that business as usual will be the way forward for the next years? Thank you, and I'll give the floor now to you.
Thank you very much, chairs. And je vais parler en français. Mais...
I'll speak French. Thank you very much for your statements and your questions. Perhaps I could begin with your last comment. Well, yes, we're right at the heart of the discussion when we're talking about a democratic decline in Africa. This is the heart of what the European Union is trying to do in our relationship with Africa, where we have a context where there is a battle of narratives, and Africa is right at the heart of the geopolitical challenge. There are a number of unaligned stakeholders who are taking up more and more place. I've heard about the presence of Russia, the presence of China. What we have to create is a transition from the old model of donor and receiver to a more sustainable political solution. And I think this is what Africans are asking of us. They no longer want the model of the past. They want us all to come together to discuss our shared interests and priorities, knowing that we don't always agree about everything, but in the European Union we have a number of advantages that we can use. And this is something we can take into account, that we in the European Union as a political stakeholder have certain possibilities. For example, we can have a regular and sustained commitment to Africa. We need to be more present. Our leaders need to be more present. The European Parliament, the MEPs, commissioners should be visiting Africa and maintaining and sustaining a link with African leaders. For example, Callas can go and represent the European Union in Africa. And what's important is to see how the European Union is viewed in Africa. It's not just about the European Union institutions, it's all of the member states. It's all of the figures who represent a European voice which is to be heard. The second point you mentioned as regards what Europe can offer politically. It's not just limited to a certain volume of financial aid. What we can offer, and this is seen in the summits we organize, for example, the one at the end of the year, this is something where we continue to be interested in principles and values and continue to be interested in African interests. And what they're interested in is major investment and development in Africa. The average age in Africa is 19, and we've heard about the need to invest in youth. And certainly this should be at the heart of our concerns. This global gateway strategy, which we've been working on for a few years, also aims at meeting this need for investment which exists in Africa. And this would be done through strategic infrastructure, through transport corridors, by creating local value chains which will create value at a local level rather than having to export the products. produced. We also need multilateral commitment. I'd like to react to what Member Payet said. The European Union and Africa, they represent together 40% of votes at the United Nations. And this is something we need to use. The European Union is the most fervent defender of the multilateral system. We defend the principles of multilateralism. And with Africa, as we've seen in discussions on the Pact for the Future last year in the UN, we reached an agreement on an agenda for reform in the UN. And similarly, we were alongside the Africans in Seville a couple of weeks ago for the conference on developing financing for development. And we will continue in our discussions for the 80 years of the United Nations. The European Union was always the greatest defender of Africa's place in the international institutions. We've called for an African seat in the G20, which we achieved a few years ago, but there are still further steps to be taken. We need to create greater visibility. There is a lot that we're doing in the European Union and in our member states in committing to Africa. Other bodies are doing perhaps less than the European Union, but we need to make what we're doing more visible. So highlighting our investment in Africa is a priority, because just as we have geopolitical tension, there is also a battle as regards information and misinformation. And Africa is the main target of Russian and Chinese disinformation, using methods which are more and more sophisticated, which undermine democracy. And this is just like others who need to be at the heart of the summit, which will be taking place at the end of the year. So combating disinformation will be part of our commitment to Africa, our commitment to through technology, through regional integration, and we also see that there are major needs. We in Europe have a number of tools at our disposal, and we need to be more consistent internally in our policies. We need to ensure that when the European Union adopts legislation, that we can anticipate the external effects of this legislation to avoid legitimate criticism which our partners can give about our certain external policy. I'd like to come back to some of the points which were made, particularly Mr. Galler's point about Côte d'Ivoire. We fully share and fully believe in the concerns that you raised. We are in the middle of elections in Côte d'Ivoire, and so as regards the issue of the headquarters, we have constantly called for peaceful, inclusive, transparent elections in Côte d'Ivoire. I also met members of the opposition in Côte d'Ivoire who came in May. I also went to Côte d'Ivoire in May, and we met members of the opposition and the coalition. The President Costa of the Council of Europe was also met representatives from Côte d'Ivoire during the last meeting. There was also an 8 million package which helps to fund the cycle of the elections to ensure that they will be peaceful, transparent and inclusive elections in Côte d'Ivoire. As regards some of the positive examples which I referred to, South Africa and Botswana, this was a point raised by the coordinator. In South Africa, what we saw was a transition where the ruling party for the past 30 years didn't obtain the absolute majority, and so there needed to be a transition which happened peacefully. And we've seen that we in the European Union were able to create a summit with South Africa and have a ministerial meeting. South Africa remains a strategic partner for us in the European Union. They are president of the G20 this year. And so it's important to work with countries such as South Africa and countries who can work as a regional amplifier, as it were. Because many of these countries have several offers on the table. There is the European Union. There are other development models also possible to them. So we need to see what we can offer, because the offers they are facing can fluctuate. So we need to remain committed to these countries to ensure that these countries will continue to support us, to support our view of the international model, because we know that other bodies, other stakeholders are trying to have influence, and these are stakeholders who have a more selective view of international law. In the case of Botswana, we're looking at a democratic transition where the party in power since 1966 handed over power in a very peaceful manner. I think I've covered most of the points which were raised and questions asked. And so by way of conclusion, and to answer the question raised by Member Assis at the beginning, this new partnership we want to set up is aiming at ensuring we listen. There's a joint creation. We're aware of the criticisms raised, and that often the European Union likes to give lessons to others and tell them what to do. Now, that's hopefully more a thing of the past. And this new partnership we're looking at is on an equal-to-equal partnership based on priorities which we set out together. This doesn't necessarily mean we agree on everything, but at least we can set out a shared program. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time left, and I know that Michael Gahler obviously wants to take the floor again, so you kick off.
Thank you. I'll now stay in English. I mean, you just referred to Côte d'Ivoire and said you have been there, and we are paying 8 million for the elections. I mean, the main contestants are not allowed to stand. The former president, Gbagbo, is not allowed to stand. The former prime minister, Guillaume Soro, is not allowed to stand, and they removed and they don't reopen the electoral roll. And Tidjane Thiam is the leader of the country's largest opposition party. He's also not on the voters' roll, and they are not reopening it, contrary to all previous elections where they have done it. And they pretend he is not a citizen. He has been a minister in this country. And we stay taciturn, we stay silent on that. I insist. I mean, anyhow, in an election where the main contestants are not allowed to stand, we can, not finance it, and of course we could also not send an election observation mission, because we know the result in advance. So I really insist that no penny is paid, not a single cent is paid of these 8 million, unless all those who want to stand in the election are allowed to stand. I mean, who are we? We are the European Union. Yeah, and I insist that our ambassador on the ground, that she takes the floor and speaks out publicly. And it's not about our standards, it's about their own standards, that they apply their own legislation. I think that is a concrete point, and I don't know whether anybody else comes in on Tanzania. That can also be mentioned in these circumstances. I need not go into details, perhaps someone takes it up. There we have a similar situation, where the opposition leader is in jail. Yeah, and our ambassador stays calm and silent. And one of our foreign ministers comes there and recently and praises the situation. I think that is not acceptable. Then we should stop all standards and all pretensions that we have any values and so on. If the African countries afford not to apply their own legislation, that is the point. Thank you.
Thank you.